action communicated, and then how is the outcome of that choice ultimately meaningful. At any time during this lecture, by the way, if people have questions or interjections or anything, just feel free to speak up, and that's fine. Okay, so like I said, the outcomes, they need to be things that the player understands. It needs to be communicated to them. So the outcomes, as we say, they need to be discernible, must be perceived in some way. So even in the case of Mario getting this little power-up mushroom here, a couple things happen that communicate to the player that they got that power-up. So first of all, the mushroom goes from being visible to invisible as soon as it touches Mario. So it's sort of a implication that he has acquired it. You know, he put it in his pocket or absorbed it somehow or something. There's a sound effect that plays, and then there's a little one-up text that is visible as well. So all of that together communicates to the player that you got this thing. And the sound effect will be like a positive sound effect. Like it sounds like something good, so you kind of know that something good happened. Up, we consider to be better than down, right? So it's these sort of simple things that we use to communicate to the player in a very small amount of time and space and effort that something good just happened when they picked up that item. The outcomes also have to be what we call integrated. And what this means is that the action has to have an immediate implication, an immediate payoff, and also a future payoff. So in the immediate sense, as soon as Mario gets this one-up mushroom, that risk is removed from the screen, right? He no longer has to chase after that mushroom to try to get it. So that's an immediate thing. But the future outcome is that if the player loses a life, now they have an extra one because they just got one, right? So we want to make sure that our outcomes are immediate and integrated. Going over the elements of the system. So in GameMaker, the objects that you're going to manipulate are literally called objects. They are the things that will do other things. All objects in games have to have attributes. Those are the properties of the object. There should be internal relationships between the objects. And then there has to be an environment in which these objects can exist, can do all these things. So this will be really straightforward, actually, when we start building our own code in a little bit, because, like I said, GameMaker Studio is based on literally calling them objects, and then you'll see all the attributes that we add to them. This next slide is just an example of some different levels that you can consider this system on. So, like if you look at the formal rules of a game like chess, the objects are the pieces themselves. The attributes are how the different pieces have different abilities to move. The internal relationships would be how those pieces relate to each other, what they can and cannot do to each other, and then the environment would be the chessboard. And then you can look at it on some different levels as well, between the players in the game, and then between the game and society, game and culture. Ultimately, the thing that separates video games from other forms of media is interactivity. So a book is a book, a movie is a movie, a TV show is a TV show. There's nothing that you can do as the consumer of those forms of media to change it. Yes, there are some exceptions, like what was that Black Mirror Bandersnatch episode, I think it was called, where you could sort of like choose a different ending, but you could only choose from the ones that were still pre-made. The great advantage, the thing that we really want to take advantage of when we're designing games, is this interactivity. And so we want the process of input and output between the player and the game to be like a continuous cycle, like a conversation would be. So we as the player, we have actions, the game processes those actions, spits back a different set of conditions as an output. We as the player process those new conditions in our mind, and we respond with our own version of output, which is our next set of actions. When we're looking at the specific breakdown of a choice itself, like I said, giving players choices is one of the ways that we really try to create this interactivity. First, you have to consider, so what were the conditions just before the player was given that choice? And you'll see how that dovetails nicely to item 5 here, which is how we create this loop, which is how is the outcome of that player conveyed. The outcome at the end of this choice will become the conditions for the next choice. How are the possibilities of the choices conveyed to the player? So if you look at this image here, it's literally like you have some choices of different dialogue that you can say, and you just push the different buttons to say them. What was the action to make that choice? So like I said, we use the buttons here. What is the outcome? Both how is it discernible, and then how would it impact future choices? In other words, be integrated. So in the case of a conversation like this, which is very typical in these Telltale games, there would be the discernible action of the character would actually say those words, so you would know that your choice was registered and reflected. And then there would be an immediate outcome in that the other player or the other character that your player was talking to would respond to that dialogue, and then it would be integrated because that choice would end up affecting the narrative elements later on. Now, that's because that reflects good game design. If it was done poorly, then it wouldn't matter which one of these dialogue choices you picked, right? The other character would say the same thing no matter what, and the story outcome wouldn't change at all. That is what we call giving the player the illusion of choice, and usually players will see through that fairly quickly. Sometimes it's worse if they don't see through it until the end, and then they get angry that they realize that all of their choices were ultimately meaningless. So you never want to try to lie to the player. You never want to try to give them an illusion. You want to make it real. When we talk about failure states, so a failure state, this is not a loss condition. We're going to talk about loss conditions in a minute. So this is not when you lose the game. This is when the player wants to stop playing the game. And this happens for a number of reasons. I've got some of the primary ones listed here. Feeling that the decisions are arbitrary. That's what I just mentioned in terms of the Telltale game, where no matter what you pick, the outcome is the same. In that case, the player feels like, well, why are you giving me these choices in the first place? You're just giving me extra work that I don't necessarily like. When the player doesn't know what to do next, I'm sure this is something that, for any of you that have played a lot of games, have experienced. Modern game design really, really, really tries to make sure that the player always knows what they're going to do next. But especially if you play older games, you'll find that this happens quite often. Losing without knowing why. So these are instances where, maybe you're playing a game and you didn't think that you got hit by that enemy bullet, but the game thought so, and you had a disagreement about why you lost, but ultimately the game is the one making the decision, so that's another reason. And then not knowing if a certain action had an outcome, both desired or otherwise. This is usually what happens while people are trying to learn the controls of the game. They're guessing and checking different inputs and looking for certain outcomes, but not necessarily getting them. So these are the things that we want to avoid. This is sort of like if you were playtesting your game or focus grouping your game with other people, this is a short checklist of things that you would want to make sure that you had covered, just so that people are not likely to experience these failure states and just want to stop playing. Feedback loops are something this is known as a cybernetic system in your game, and these are things that are particularly useful in terms of just adding some simple artificial intelligence that will make the game experience more dynamic and potentially more fun and interesting for your player. So we've got two types that we'll describe real quick: negative and positive feedback loops. Basically, a negative feedback loop just says if a certain value is, let's say, below a certain threshold, then you want to compensate for that in some way. So in the case of a thermostat, if it gets below X number of degrees in your house, you want to add heat to balance it. So a negative feedback loop inspires stability and balance. In the case of something like Mario Kart, what happens is players that are further back in the race will often get better items. And this is designed to sort of try to keep the race close, right? Because in a racing game, if players are way out in front of other players and some players are way behind other players, it's not fun, right? A racing game is fun because it's neck and neck for as long as possible. But you still want to reward players who are of higher skill levels. So that's why it's not automatically balanced, but they tend to get better items, and it fosters that stability. A positive feedback loop, this is where you want to foster instability. This is when you want things to go crazy a little bit. So think about a thermostat where if you got above a certain temperature, it would add heat. In other words, the conditions in the environment are warm, and then we just make them even warmer. Think about in Mario Kart, if players who were in better positions got the better items, how much different that experience would be. Now, maybe that's what you want. Maybe you want to design a game that really punishes players for not having a high enough skill set to be far ahead in the race, right? That's up to you. That's where your design comes in. Ideally, these cybernetic systems are something that are supposed to kind of fade into the background, right? We don't like it as human players when we start to notice these systems being sort of interfering with our games a lot. We tend to like it better when we feel like, we as the humans are in control and everything we do or don't do in the game is because of us. One example that's particularly easy to pick out, again, in racing games, they're just easy for these examples, is in a racing game when they foster this stability, this artificial competition by, let's say, always having the second place racer just behind the first place racer. So if you're in first place, it's like no matter how good you do, that computer opponent is always right behind you. And if that's artificial, and if you start to notice that it's artificial, then you as the player start to get frustrated. So any dynamic difficulty adjustment, which is usually what these feedback loops are used for, again, you just want to make it a subtle thing. You want to make it something that is not very easy for people to recognize. And then real quick, I'll just go over victory and loss conditions. So these are the things that tell a player either I've won, I've succeeded in whatever the challenge was, or I lost. And we've all experienced, any number of different victory and loss conditions. So it can be amassing a certain score or numeric value, depending on what you're doing. In a sports game, right, we still use scores. Clearing a level or all the levels, reaching a certain item or area, finishing first in a race, it's limitless. Examples of certain typical loss conditions are running out of time, running out of health, falling off the board, not getting to a certain item before a time limit, things like this. So these are the things that determine when the game is over, both from a successful point of view and from a unsuccessful point of view. And this is just something that, again, you always need to have in your game. Fairness is important to remember that fairness is a perception. When we talk about building fairness into our games, it's something that is very subjective. It's not something that you can mathematically perfect and just plug into your game and say that we've checked that box and we've made our game fair. It's a perception from the player's standpoint. So you've got to consider what are the things that your game is doing or not doing that will make the player feel like things are fair. Ultimately, even if a game is very, very challenging, that's okay. A lot of gamers enjoy a good challenge when they play a video game. They just have to feel like that challenge is a fair one. And then here we just want to talk about what do we use for representing the different aspects of our game to the player? Because a lot of times there's going to be so much information that if you think about, when you're walking around your day-to-day life, you don't need a little heads-up display telling you your energy level because you have a part of your mind that tells you I'm feeling good or I'm not feeling good or my leg hurts or whatever, right? Or I have some piece of candy in my mouth and it tastes good, right? But for us in a game sense, we don't have the advantage of such a robust world. We have to spell a lot of that out for our players. So how do we do that? How do we represent all of these other important things to the player without the luxury of all those other senses and such? So we use these kind of little shortcuts, right? So a classic one is to have some sort of a number or a bar that represents, in this case, health for the player. So that's what the blue bar is here. But there's even more going on in this particular example. So we have the blue bar that shows sort of like one increment of health, but then each one of these squares above represents a full increment. And you see the 99 to the left. So like right now we're at full health for this one increment, but we have like 10 others to go. In the lower left here, we've got all these symbols. In the lower right, we've got some more symbols. And those represent, on the left, the different like visors that this player can use. This is from Metroid Prime, to view the environment around them. And then the one on the right are the different hand configurations that would represent the weapon that that player is going to use. So in this version of representation, what they try to do is have these icons, which are then very simple to understand, reflect something that is not so simple to understand. For instance, over here we have our normal target scope, we have our X-ray vision, we have this one to zoom in on things, we have one for thermals. And then on the right, they tried to tie it more to the narrative universe by saying, we're not just going to have an icon for the different weapons, but actually for the configuration that this hero would supposedly have their hand in order to use one of those weapons. So it's up to you whether you want to be more direct or more narrative-based. As long as you're properly communicating to your player what you need them to know, then you're doing a good job. We can also think of this as the game as a whole. So Pong is a representation of table tennis. A game like SimCity is a representation of urban planning, urban development. Right? So you can think of representation on two different levels here. When it comes to narrative structures, there's two different ways to really think about it. First is an embedded narrative structure, and this is the type of story that cannot be changed or is designed really not to be changed by the user's input. And then there's an emergent narrative, which is one that emerges as the user interacts with that game. So if you think about the embedded narrative in something like a game of Madden or Mario Brothers, so in Madden, the embedded narrative is, the Los Angeles Chargers are playing against the Denver Broncos, and they're playing, and it's snowing that day because it's in Denver, and it's a chance to go to the playoffs, right? But the emergent narrative of that game would be that the game came down to a final Hail Mary pass in the last seconds of the fourth quarter to go ahead by 3 points and win, something like that, right? So you can kind of think of the embedded narrative as the pre-generated part you can't really change, and the emergent parts are if you were keeping a journal of that specific play experience, like what would happen, what would be the events that would go down in that journal. And then I think this is my last slide. Yep. So a few notes, especially when it comes to narrative. I'll just sum up simply what's on this slide. Is you want to make sure that the events and the content inside your game are as closely tied to the narrative or the story that you want to tell as possible. So the way in which you really succeed at telling a story with a game, and in particular, since games are not always necessarily known for telling their stories, and part of that is because if it's an interactive media, you want the player to sort of be able to chart their own path, right, and create their own story. So then you need to make sure that all the things that they can do, all the things that they can interact with, reflect that world and that narrative you're trying to build. So, for instance, why do I have this image of an old Super Mario game here? Well, it's because you can look through this image and you can look and see all of these crazy things going on, and you can actually start to pick out a lot of the story. So I want to open this up to discussion for 3 seconds. Just picking apart this image, even if you know about these characters already, What would this tell you about the narrative or the setting of that world? What can you get just from this image here?
I could
Mario is
say
hopelessly outnumbered.
Okay, yeah, absolutely. That's a good observation. Yeah, so we've got really the one hero, and in a way, we kind of know based on the size of the other characters that this is the main one here in red, right? And the forces of evil here are way higher in number. Absolutely. What else?
I would say that this this guy's like really cheeky and like really fast or something because
Yeah. Okay.
he's just like outrunning them. I would also think that the other guy is interested in the girl because he is taking the girl away.
He's the one holding her hand.
Yeah, so
I can
I
see
would
that.
get that perception. I don't know if that's true or not, but that is what I would get.
Well, well, you used the word cheeky, right? But I think I think that does communicate something well, which is that Super Mario as a character, it's not the most dark and gritty and serious form of conflict, right? Yes, it is this sort of battle of good versus evil, but it's always in this lighthearted, fun kind of way. What else do we got? There's a couple other things that we could touch on here. Try to think of the more abstract kind of random things that seem to be in this picture. There are plenty of them.
I see something on the cloud throwing a mine down or a spiky ball down.
Yes.
That could be a character helping, and he doesn't seem evil.
Okay.
He looks kind of nice.
That's a
then
good
there's just
observation.
Some tile, like some dice tiles floating around
Mm-hmm.
that might hint that that exists. Like if I didn't know Mario, I would say like I don't know that this might be like a music tile thing. But knowing Mario, I would say like I know like they're floating around and actually
Right.
I like that.
Yeah, I mean, basically, I think what you're touching on. So, first of all, yeah, it is kind of interesting that that one character, who is definitely an enemy, he's throwing spiked things at our heroes. It's a little tough to tell from here, but that character is one that ultimately becomes like that character runs the camera during Mario Kart games and during some of the future 3D games. So that character ends up becoming kind of like a in between character, like not totally bad, not totally good. And I think the music and the checkerboard for the ground there are just supposed to show you, the music notes are supposed to show you that this is a world of like fanciful whimsy, right? This is not like a very serious world. There's a lot of fun things that go on here, even though it is still showing this battle between good and evil and trying to rescue people from other evil monsters with sharp teeth and claws and all that. But it's definitely going to be a world where your character can have two sets of ears and a raccoon tail and all of that stuff and fly through the air, right? Okay. All right, so that's it for the PowerPoint. So now, so we're gonna, hopefully you're all at this menu here, and we're gonna just click on New on the left here to create a new project. And it's going to give us two choices, and we want the drag and drop option. And I'll explain in a moment what those mean. But basically, it's just whether or not you want the ability to drag and drop pre-made chunks of code, or whether you want to make the whole thing from scratch with your own code. But I would like us to be able to enjoy both, and so that's what the drag and drop will do for us. Can you all see the little...
Joe,
Yeah. Yes.
There's a question in the chat here from Daniel that says, hey, Joe, is there a link to the download for PC users?
Yeah, it should all be in the same folder. Did people not have access to the entire folder's contents? If not, I can just paste it right here.
Double check, but when last time I was checking, it was to the Mac version. So I can open it up and double check.
Yeah, no problem. And I can paste
The
it in.
folder does have both versions in it. I believe the PC version is the second one.
Yeah. Should be.
Then send that out. Thank you.
You got it?
Yep.
Okay,
All
good. Okay, and can you all see this little dialog box, or is it only showing GameMaker still? Like, can you see the?
it.
Okay, good. So I'm naming this workshop _ demo _ 001. Since we're only going to be using this one project throughout the entire series of the workshops, you can name it whatever you like. But as long as it's something that is going to make sense for you later. And then hit save, and then it will build this sort of home workspace for you. And throughout this process, like I said, just type up if I'm going too fast. I'm going to try to go at a fast enough speed so that we can adequately cover everything. But yeah, if I end up going too quickly, just please stop me, because if people get behind, that's when it's really going to start to be difficult. Okay, so if you look on the left here, we have all these different folders, and as you can see from the icons, most of them are empty. Most of them have nothing in them. The one that does have something in them is rooms. So if we click on the little triangle to drop down what's in rooms, we see that we have one pre-built room number 1 that is waiting for us. So I'm going to double click on that, and this opens up the room editor in the rest of our space here. And the first thing I'm going to do, just for the sake of making this easy for us to understand, is I'm going to right-click on where it says Room 1, and I'm just going to rename this, because Room 1 is not a very descriptive title for this area. And I'll start showing you this common practice, which is to give all of your different assets in your game a little prefix. So the prefix for rooms is RM _. And so I'm going to call it RM _ platformer. So what we're going to be building today are the first pieces of a typical platformer game. And so I'm just going to name this room as a reflection of that. And then the other thing that I want to do, just to make sure that we're all sort of on the same page, and so you can sort of get used to the idea of tweaking some of these aspects of the room and everything, is you should see on the lower left, you should see a place where it says properties for the room, and then room settings, and you should see a width and a height. And I just want to make sure, depending on whatever values that you might have for your default room width, I just want to change it to 1024, so 1024. And then if you hit enter, you might see it'll actually reflect that new width in our room space here in the center. Just a point of information, so you see how I'm like able to click and drag things around our little workspace. So the real easy way to do that is if you have a mouse that has a third button, a middle button, or a scroll wheel that has a button, you can just click that middle button and drag things around your workspace. If you don't have that, there's this little icon up here, which is turn on and off laptop mode. And if you turn it on, then you can use Alt. You can hold Alt and then move the mouse around, and it'll move things in your workspace. Okay, so this black rectangle here, this is our room. This is our first game world, and everything that we are going to create is going to exist inside of this room, at least for now. So we need to start creating some things that are going to exist in this room. there are two different assets that we need in order to create stuff that's going to exist in this room. The first one is a sprite, and the second one is an object. And these are always going to go together. So sprites are just the visual representation of our object. So pretty much all the time, we're going to create a sprite and then associate an object with it. And so this first thing that we're going to do is I'm going to right-click on sprites here, and then I'm going to go up to create, and then sprite. And I'll immediately rename this. The prefix for sprites is just sp underscore, and I'm going to name it platformer underscore bg for background, and hit enter. And in here, it should automatically bring up our little sprite editor window. And I'm just going to guide you through kind of what we absolutely bare bones need to know in order to start editing these things. So for right now, we can ignore everything except there's this little button in the upper left that says edit image. So I'm going to click on that. This brings up the specific image editor. And you can kind of think of this as like a super extremely simple Photoshop, like super duper simple. And here we've got our different tools that we're going to use to edit the image, and then our color picker up here. And above that are the different sized brushes that we can use to paint and draw with. And then below that are different layers. Now, we're not going to do anything with layers for right now. For right now, since I called this the platformer background, we're going to use this as exactly that. We're going to put an image in the background of our platformer. And for right now, during the workshops, just follow along with my extremely simple artistic techniques, because what you're going to be able to do as your optional homework between these workshops is make these as pretty as you want and as detailed and as complex as you want. So for today, I'm just going to pick this little sky blue color here by clicking on it, and then I'm going to go down to our little fill tool, paint bucket tool, and then click anywhere in the space, and it's going to fill the whole thing with that one color. And for right now, that's all I need to do in terms of editing this image. So you can see up near the top, we've got these different tabs for all the things we've already been working on, right? We've got our room, we've got our image editor. So I'm going to hit the X to exit out of that. And I can double click on my sprite in the list of assets on the right here. And I just see that our new preview of the image reflects the changes that we made. So it's just one big solid color. And that's all we really need to do for it for right now. In order to make this the actual background of that room, I'm going to double click on that room. And on the left, you see the layers that are available for the room. And right now we're on the instances layer, and this is where you put all of the things that are supposed to like do stuff in your game. But the layer beneath that is background. So if I click on that, you'll see that I get a new option in the middle of the window here. And right in the middle, there's a button that says no sprite. If I click on that, I get a little dialog box that has a folder referring to my sprites in it. And then if you click on that, you'll see all the sprites that you've created so far in a little thumbnail. So I just click on our little blue box that we just made. How is everyone so far? Not going too fast, right? Everybody good? Does anyone need me to repeat anything? Okay. All right, I'm moving on. So at the moment, we have a blue box, but it doesn't really make for a very good background. In that same window where we selected the image, we've got a couple of options. One of them is to stretch the image, so we can stretch it across the whole background, or we can have it tile vertically or tile horizontally. If you check both of those tile techniques, then it will paint it across the whole room. for our purposes for right now, either checking both of the tile boxes or just checking the stretch box is totally fine. As you can see, the result is identical. When you go and edit this image for your own sort of like custom purposes, you'll see the difference that, if you just clicked stretch, it would take whatever that image was and stretch it across the whole background. Whereas if you tile it, you'd have that same image over and over and over again throughout the whole background. So for right now, either one is fine. All right, so next we're going to create 2 new sprites that are going to represent the player character, and then one that's going to represent the blocks that that player character is going to be able to stand on and jump between. So I'm going to go back to sprites and do create, and then sprite. And this first one I'm going to call SP_block. And just like before, I'm going to edit my image. And I'm just going to do a differently colored block. I'm going to do sort of this grass-colored green here. And fill in that space with the paint bucket fill tool. And that's all that I need to do for that. And so I'm going to create yet another sprite and call this one SP_player for the player character. I'm going to edit this image, and for this one, I'm going to get very fancy, and I'm going to draw a stick figure. And so I'm going to use this paintbrush tool, which is the first one on the upper left of the toolbox. And it's really up to you which brushes you want to use. The bottom ones are circular, the top ones are square. So you get a little preview of the size when you bring it in. So I'm going to use yellow because it's something that's going to stand off well against the blue of the background that we have, and also not clash with the green for the blocks. Now, when you create your stuff and then edit it later, you can, of course, be a lot more detailed, and you can, of course, use whatever colors you think are going to look best. But I'm just creating this happy little stick figure guy. Oh, that was not ideal. Control Z or edit undo to undo any mistakes that you made. And of course, I'm going to give him a nice smiley face because he is so happy to be here. And then what I'm going to do is, actually, let me make sure that my space for his body is reasonably wide, because I'm going to do something which is draw a little heart in the middle, and it will become clear why in a moment. But it's going to make sure that it's like small enough, and of course looks perfectly like a heart. Boom. And so for now, this is fine. And when you get to this point, what we're going to do is just duplicate this one frame, because we're going to make a simple 2-frame animation here. And so the way that we're going to do this is, once you've got your first frame all done, just in the upper portion of this image editor, if you right-click, you can see a couple different options if you right-click on this first frame that we've created. And one of them is copy, and if you right-click right next to it and do paste, you get a perfect duplicate of that first frame that we created. And it doesn't really matter which one of these you edit, because it's just going to be a 2-frame animation. but you can select them by clicking on the different frames up above here, and you see the little green line underneath will change depending on which one you've got selected. And all I'm going to do is use that same red once again, and I'm just going to draw the heart a little bit bigger around. And so my goal, and this is not going to look great right away, but if you see up next to the frames here, if you click the little play button, it will animate those 2 frames, and it will show you a preview of your animation. So I went with the beating heart because it's something that is really simple, that we can just show that this character is like literally alive, and oftentimes hearts are used in games to show health and things like that. Also, yeah.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but
That's
where's
okay.
the copy sign? Like how do I copy it again?
Yeah, if you just right-click on one
top?
of
the... Okay, got it.
and then
Thank you.
copies right in the middle. Yeah, and then just right-click next to it and do paste. Yep. So yeah, one of the reasons why I did something that was internal in terms of this character's silhouette is because for right now, all I will say is that the way in which GameMaker is going to determine like physics and space between characters and objects is going to be based on their outline. And so I didn't want to make an animation that was going to change the outline, not yet. So I wanted to do something that was like internal to that character. So once you have your 2 frames there, we can hit the X at the top of that editor to go back to this overall sprite menu. And there's a couple things that we want to change here. So again, we can click play, and you can see our 2 frames of animation. But right now, it's animating that character as fast as the game will possibly allow us to, which, as you can see from a visual standpoint, is not ideal. So if you look kind of upper mid-left of that window, you'll see where it says FPS, and it stands for frames per second. And this only applies to the sprite animation. So we're not changing the frames per second that our actual game will run at. Right now, we're just changing the animation speed of this character. So I'm going to change it to 5 and hit enter again. And I think that, and hit play again. And I think that is a much more reasonable animation speed for our little heartbeat there. And then there's one other thing that we need to do here, which is the origin point. So you'll see in the upper right corner of this menu, we see origin 0 by 0 and a little drop-down menu that says top left. If you look at the sprite itself, you'll see kind of a little faint outline of a box around our sprite. And then in the upper left, you see a little kind of target crosshair reticle thing. And the box represents the boundaries of our sprite, the full dimensions that it's taking up in the game on the screen. And in the upper left, that little reticle represents the origin point. Now, the origin point is important because the origin point is where the game program is going to reference this character from. So from our perspective, we see it as humans as a stick figure, and it's got arms and legs and a head and everything. But the game doesn't understand it that way, not yet. The game just understands it as a collection of mostly yellow pixels. And it doesn't know where the top or the bottom is or anything like that. And so when we start to use this sprite, when we start to associate it with an object and have it do stuff in our game, we need to tell the game, where do you want me to refer to this thing from? And for a lot of things, top left is fine, but the next most common one that we're going to use, if you click on this drop down, is middle center. And as you can see, as soon as we select middle center, it's going to put that little crosshair right smack dab in the middle of our sprite box there. And so all this says is it's telling the game, when you're referring to this object, start referring to it from the middle and work outwards. The reason why middle center is good for us for something like a player character is because we want this player character to be able to interact with things from all directions, right? From 360 degrees around itself. And so because of that, we never really know when it's going to be most advantageous to refer to that character from an upper left corner or a lower right corner. So if we put it in the middle, we know that we're pretty much safe from everything that we want to do with this character going forward. Questions or issues up until this point? Everybody good? Anyone need me to stop?
Yes, sorry. How would I set one of the sprites as the background?
As the background for the room?
Yes.
Okay. So we double click on the room in our list of assets here. And then in the middle of what should be the room editor window on the left here, yours probably says no sprite. So if you click on no sprite, you should get a new dialog box that offers you any of the sprites that you've created thus far. And you want to just click on the one that we made specifically for that room. All good? Okay, cool. Okay, so now in our assets, we have 3 sprites. We have one that we've used for the background image. We have one that we've got for set aside for a block object, and then one set aside for our player object. So now let's actually go to this objects folder, and we'll right click and create an object. And the prefix for object is OB underscore. And you want to make sure that your names after the prefixes are consistent. So we called our sprite SP underscore block. So we want to call the object that corresponds to it OB underscore block. And for right now, now that we've got it created, just like we did for the background, we can associate with a sprite by clicking right here where it says no sprite. We get our lists and we select our block. And then I'm going to do the same exact thing for our player object. Right click, create new object, OB underscore player. And then where it says no sprite, I'm going to select the player. Okay, so we've got our objects created and we've got sprites associated with them. So now if we go back, if we double click on our room, we can start placing objects in the room. You don't place sprites in the room, you only place objects. Like I said, sprites are just the visual representation of the object, but GameMaker, the game itself, doesn't really care too much about sprites because sprites on their own don't do anything. Sprites just appear. Sprites just look. So objects are the things that we care about. But before we start placing them in the room, we have to highlight the instances layer. So we went to the background layer so we could change the background. Now we need to click on the instances layer again in our room. And once we have that selected, we can go to our objects in our asset list. And one thing you can do is you can literally just click and drag and place them in to your room. That will work. But since the first thing that we're going to place are these block objects, and we want to be able to place several of them at a time, what you can do instead is if you hold the right Alt key while you have an object selected, you'll see that object appear underneath your cursor. And what this means is that if you now start to click and drag, you can essentially draw with that object. So you can place them one after another. And what I'm going to do is just sort of make this little base for our platformer room, but I'm also going to put like that little incline in there, that little staircase. And what that's going to allow us to do in a little bit is just give our player character somewhere to go and something to climb up once we enable them to walk and jump in a few minutes. So again, when it comes time for your optional homework in between these sessions, one of the things is going to be to make the level design as fun and creative as you want. But for now, just make it nice and boring and just follow along with what I'm doing so that everything is consistent between what I'm showing you and what you're doing. So we've got our ground for the player to run and walk on. And I only need one player object, obviously. So for this, I am just going to literally click and drag them in, and I'm just going to place them near the start. I say near the start because I'm used to things like platformers going from left to right. So I'm placing him on the left. Questions, issues, everyone good up until this point? Everyone have a room that looks more or less like this? I will take your silence as a resounding and enthusiastic yes. Both of those things, resounding and enthusiastic. Okay, so we're actually this is good because we're actually a little bit ahead of schedule now. Alex, are you still with us?
Hey, yes.
Alex Chase, ladies and gentlemen. So did you want me to go? Did you want me to aim for 7:30 or aim for 8 o'clock? It's totally up to you.
7:30 is what we told everyone here.
Okay,
yeah.
Sounds good.
Yeah, thanks for asking.
Because I think that's I think I'm pretty much on pace for that.
Sweet.
Yeah, actually, yeah, 7:30. Yep, good. Okay, so now the quote unquote hard part begins. But hopefully I made it a lot easier for you. So now is where we will need the Word document where I provided the code that we're going to be using. And if you look at that document, so I broke it down into the different days. Like I've got a really big header for workshop day 1 and then the date. And so everything that we're going to be doing today is just on those first 2 pages. And it ends at the start of page 3 where it says workshop day 2. So you don't need to copy and paste it right now, but you do need to have access to it. And so what we're going to do now is, if I go to my objects list here, and if I double click on my player object, so you'll see on the very left is where we had the place where we set the sprite, and there's a couple of default values here. The visible box is checked for us, which we want. We definitely want it to be visible. And we can pretty much ignore everything else in that box for now. The one on the right of that first box where it says events, so that's where we want to start working right now. And I talked during the lecture about objects having attributes. And the attributes are the things that give the objects their abilities, that define what the objects do, right? So right now, I mean, we could technically run this game right now, and it would do nothing. It would look like a picture, like a still image, because it would just be that player object on top of those green blocks with a nice, pretty blue background, and that would be it. That would be everything. So in order to give the objects the ability to do things, we need to give them attributes. And we give them attributes in GameMaker through events. Events are the things that quite plainly just trigger the attributes to go into effect. So the events are basically like the program is asking you, when do you want me to do certain things? And like I said, if you're new to coding, especially game coding, you have to spell out absolutely everything. You have to tell the program absolutely everything in terms of how you want these objects and things to behave. It has no idea. It has no preconceived notions. So we need to spell out everything for it. So if you click in the lower, at the bottom of that window where it says Add Event, and you'll get this list of all of these different possible events. And if you kind of hover your mouse through them, you'll see that even these events have subcategories of events. I'm definitely not going to go over all of them. I'm certainly not going to go over all of them today. I'm just going to go over the ones that you need. So for right now, the one at the very top that says Create has a little light bulb. Click that. And so what is reflected is, so we have a Create event. And to the right of that, and like I said, you can use either the, if you have a middle button to kind of click and drag over, you can do that. Or you can, if you clicked on laptop mode up here, this little icon, if you turn that on, then you can just hold the Alt key and move your mouse. Either way, we need to be able to see what came of it. So right now, if you look at the upper left of that new window, it says OB player : create. So this window just reflects the events that are going to be triggered when this object is created. In other words, when this object is first loaded into memory by GameMaker, this is all the stuff that it's going to do. And if you look on the right-hand side of that window, we have all of these options for, these are the drag and drop chunks of code that GameMaker provides for us. And eventually we're going to be using some of these, but actually for today, we're going to be using this one. And it's called Execute Code. If you type in code up the little search bar there, it should start sorting some of them for you. And it's this one. It looks like an angled bracket with an underscore. And if you hover your mouse over it, it says Execute Code, and it's kind of maroonish in color. So if you click and drag that one into the middle of that window, that middle space, and it always pushes them off to the left a little bit because it's just so wide. So again, use either your middle mouse button or the left Alt button to sort of recenter it better. So you'll see this Execute Code widget that comes up. And in here, we can type whatever we like. And that is going to allow us to dictate what code is executed when this player object is created, right? So it's something that's only going to happen one time, right when this player is created. And in order to get this code, here is where I'm going to ask you to copy and paste those first 4 lines of code that are in that document under Create Event. So don't copy the actual word Create Event, just the 4 lines of code that are underneath it, and come back and then paste that into this little window here. And as you're doing that, I'll let you know what these represent. So since this is happening at the Create event for this player character, we are just assigning some variables that we've created with some starting or default values. So we have HSP, which means, in our case, horizontal speed. We have VSP for vertical speed. We have GRV for gravity. And we have walk SP for walking speed. Now, the initial values for our horizontal and vertical speed should be 0. We don't want to be moving yet. So we start those at 0. But we do need to declare them. We do need to give them these little default values, because the way that GameMaker works, which is not unlike a lot of other coding languages, is you can't refer to a variable unless you've declared it initially, unless you've given it some sort of starting value. Lamine wants to know what language this is. This is a proprietary language. It is its own language. It is literally just called GML or GameMaker language. So it's its own code. But it is probably most similar to Java. It probably shares the most in common with Java. Yep, but it is its own thing. Okay, and then this third one, you'll see I made a little comment. So the double slash here and then the green text indicates that this is a comment. Comments are things that you can insert into your own code so that you have some sort of note-taking method for yourself, but it won't actually impact the code in any way, and that's good. So the note that I made here is we're calling this GRV and not gravity because gravity, Gravity, is already a built-in variable in GameMaker. So GameMaker comes with all of these predefined variables, which is, of course, very convenient for us, but we're not really going to be using them, at least not right away. So you just want to make sure, if you're coding on your own there and you're thinking like, yeah, GRV, that doesn't really mean anything to me. I'm going to change it to something that makes more sense, like gravity. You can't do that in this instance because gravity already exists, and we're not going to use it. So we have a starting gravity of 0.3. What does this mean? Well, it means that if gravity were a thing that we had to spell out, and in this case we do, we're trying to give a value of how strong do we want gravity to be. In other words, how forceful do we want things to be pulled down in our game. And what 0.3 represents is 0.3 pixels per frame of the game. So those of you who are used to playing games, you're probably used to trying to get things to run at high of an FPS or frames per second as possible. And what that means is your visual refresh rate for your game. But for us, in this context here, we understand frames per second or steps per second, basically in the same way that you would think of different frames of film along a film strip, or different frames of animation along an animation line. The game processes things in terms of one frame or one step at a time, one right after another. The default speed is 60 frames per second. So you can kind of do some math and figure like, well, so, if we're multiplying 0.3 pixels by the number of frames per second, what this translates to is basically how far down the screen is that object going to fall if we've given it a gravity of 0.3. I know that there might be a lot to sort of take in for right now. Again, you don't really need to understand every aspect of it at this moment. You just need to know what this value is doing, and what it's doing is determining a certain speed of falling that represents gravity. And then our walk SP, our walking speed of 4, this operates similarly. It's basically 4 pixels per frame, and that's going to be, once this character starts moving, that's going to be how fast do we want it to move. So if we give this a larger value, then they'd have a faster walking speed. If it was a smaller value, they'd have a slower walking speed. So you can change this on your own later if you want, but for now, we're just going to start with 4. Okay, so that's everything that we need for the create event. Now, we also need one more event for this player character, and that is a step event. So if you go down, so if you click add event and then step, you'll get this little sub menu, and you've got step, begin step, and end step. You can ignore begin and end step. If you want to know what those do, you can ask me, later or something like that. But for now, we're just going to click on step. And I said that these events execute everything that's inside of them, everything that's in this window on the right here, when these events are triggered. And I said that the create event happens one time when that object is first loaded into memory. It's going to run this code. Conversely, the step event is going to execute every possible moment of processing in our game. So step event are things that you want to run constantly. Step event items is code that you want to be happening all the time. So step event are things that are good for, in this case, controls, which is what we're going to do next, because we want the player to be able to control this character at all times. Step events are good for things that you want to be constantly checking for, like a comparison between values or win conditions or loss conditions. Those are typically always going to go in your step event. Similar as with the create event, we're just going to drag and drop this little execute code widget in here. And this is where I'm going to paste, copy and paste all of the stuff that is under the step event in that Word document that I uploaded for you. So everything under step event all the way down to that last curly bracket before we get to workshop day 2. Paste it all in there. Okay. So there is a lot going on here, and what can kind of be humorous is, if you understand coding, or even if you don't understand coding yet, what can kind of be humorous is thinking about needing all of this code, and we're only doing a couple of simple things. And I'll walk you through the code and explain what it is that we're doing. So first, we are creating a couple of variables called key left, key right, and key jump. And we're giving them a value of keyboard checks. Keyboard checks are just built-in functions in GameMaker. They're just asking the question, is a certain key being pressed at the moment? So we've got one for left, one for right, one for space. You all can go back later if you want. I know a lot of you that are used to playing games on your keyboard are used to using WASD to move around. You can go back and change these yourselves later if you want. I'm using left and right and the space bar. So these little variables just represent whether or not those keys are being pressed. In order to calculate movement, I've got a new variable, which is key right minus key left. Well, what the heck does that mean? When these values are created up top, the keyboard checks return either a 1 or a 0. Either it's on or it's off. So in order to calculate movement, we can do that in a mathematical way by subtracting key right from key left. In other words, if key right is 1 and key left is 0, then 1 minus 0 equals 1. And we know our movement is positive. If key right is 0 and key left is 1, then it's 0 minus 1, which equals negative 1, and we know our movement is negative. In other words, to the left. In GameMaker, the quadrant this operates in terms of x and y coordinates dictates such that positive values are to the right, negative values are to the left. Positive values are down, negative values are up. Again, you don't need to memorize these things. I'm just trying to give some context. Our horizontal speed is going to be equal to that movement, which is now either positive 1 or negative 1, times our walking speed variable that we created before. So that's where that number 4 comes in. So now our horizontal speed is either 1 times 4 or negative 1 times 4. So it's either positive 4 pixels or negative 4 pixels, to the right 4 pixels or to the left 4 pixels. This next chunk just basically says, uses a place meeting function to check our current location plus 1, in other words, down 1 on the y-axis, and see, is there an instance of the block object beneath us? If it is, and the user pushes the jump key, then execute this line of code, which subtracts 7 from our vertical speed. In other words, launches us up at a speed of 7 pixels per second. So this little check is just saying, is there ground beneath us, and has the user pushed jump? If so, then allow them to jump. But we don't want them to be able to jump if there's no ground beneath them, so that's what that does. The horizontal collision is basically very similar. It's just saying if there's a block next to us, and it checks next to us based on our current horizontal speed. If there is that block, then don't move us. But if there is that block, then don't move us. But if there isn't that block, then go ahead and move us as is dictated by our horizontal speed value. This while loop that's here, this is basically to handle in case we have a sort of an odd distance between us and that object. I won't get too deep into this right now, but if we're moving in increments of 4, but not every object is always going to be just 4 pixels away, so we need this while loop to be able to handle what happens when that object is 3 pixels away or 1 or right. Vertical collision is identical. The only difference is that we have to have this line of code down here, which accounts for gravity. Obviously, we don't need to account for gravity in our horizontal movement. And then this line here, which also says basically if there is a block beneath them, you don't want them to fall through that block, right? These are the kind of things that we need to spell out for the game. Okay. So I think that's the single largest chunk of code for all of these demos. So if that was a lot to swallow, don't worry. I think that's pretty much as complicated as we get for this little series of workshops. Hopefully you can go back and look at it and understand it a little bit. It helps if you have some prior coding knowledge, but you can always contact me, send me an email or something if it's a part you don't understand. For instance, there are some typical coding practices. Like here, we have our exclamation point in front of the place meeting. Those that are familiar with some coding will know that exclamation point before something usually means the inverse of or not. So this is asking if not place meeting, right? So stuff like that. Okay, so first, now that we've got this in place, let's do something crazy that we haven't done yet, and let's actually run our game. We only have one other thing to do, so we should be able to do this in time. So up at the sort of top left of the GameMaker program, you should see a little play button. And if we click that play button, we should see this. And this is our character in the level that we created. And he can move left and right, and he can't jump at the moment. And I think I kind of know why that is. Let me change something real quick. Move him slightly off the ground first and see if that was the problem. Still no. Let me see what's going on. I assume you're all having the same issue. Let me see if that was it. I changed I had a capital VSP. I just want to see if that was the issue. Yep, it was. Okay. So in the code, at line 13, I had capital VSP, and it should have been lowercase. Okay. Is everyone able to see this, by the way? My game actually running.
No.
I'm sorry?
No, we can't.
Not at the moment.
Okay. How about now?
Yes, we can.
Okay, good. I think it's just a matter of Zoom recognizing this as a separate program. Okay, so is anyone not at this point where we have a character that can move and jump and does not fall through the ground, and you see its little adorable heart beating? Anyone have issues getting there?
Oh, yeah, I could not figure out how to add an event.
Oh, it's just so when you have the if you double click on the player object, you see this window to the right of it that says events, and then at the bottom of that window you click add event, and then you select whichever one you want. And then once you've got it listed in the events, then you can double click on them to get this window on the right here. And this is where you would actually copy and paste in the code and everything.
Professor, my
Yes.
character went off the screen and now it's gone. Like,
Did it go off the bottom of the screen?
it went to the right, so like it's off the
Oh,
level.
yes,
but
yes, yes.
It just vanished. Can't come back.
Yes, that's okay. That's again, we haven't told the game to be able to handle what happens if the character moves all the way off the right of the screen. So if we will handle that eventually, but for now, that's okay. It's operating as we told it.
That's so funny. It's a runaway doodle.
Yep. Yep.
I'm actually trying to find it.
Any other questions? I mean, I can tell you, your character, if it's still running, your character is most likely falling in a literally infinite abyss, in a bottomless pit that is as large as your computer can handle.
Poor guy.
That's comforting.
That's terrifying.
Yep. I know.
Somebody's having a very bad Friday.
But luckily, you can just stop it and restart and get them back.
Save the doodle.
Exactly.
Save them.
Okay. Anything else before I wrap up for this evening? Make sure that let's do this very important thing together. Every time you hit play, it automatically saves your game, but there's this little save icon, which I'm sure you've seen in other programs. It's very popular. Save feature is very popular in a lot of applications. So just make sure you're clicking that. Probably a good idea to get in the habit of doing that every now and then. But make sure you've done that before we sign off for the night.